Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is truly a leading scholar in this space. Silvio Waisbord is director and professor of the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Diego Gomez Sara, a doctoral candidate at Northwestern and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Silvio in just a minute. I'm delighted to note that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Ethnography Workshop in the Department of Sociology, and the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Program. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me briefly say how the seminar will unfold. First, Diego will tell us more about Silvio's research and career in just a minute. Then Silvio will deliver his seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar, and Diego will moderate. At the end, we will deliver closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Diego, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Pablo. I'm pleased to be with you all this morning, and I have the chance to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Silvio Weisbord. Professor Weisbord is the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. He received a PhD in sociology from the University of California, San Diego, and he also has a licenciatura in sociology from the Universidad of Buenos Aires. Professor Weisbord started a journey across different communication subfields to understand the future of communication as a discipline. His career is built on cross-cultural perspectives, multiple specializations in the area of communications, and provides new perspectives to research, write, and publish in communication studies. He has authored 9 books, including The Communication Manifesto, El Imperio de la Utopía, and Communication, a Post-Discipline. I have it here with me. Professor Weisbord also has edited 9 books, including 3 Routledge Companions and the Handbook of Global Health Communication. He has published more than 60 articles in referred journals, including Political Communication, American Behavioral Scientist, Digital Journalism, and Journal of Communication. His work has transcended borders and languages. Professor Weisbord has written more than 60 books, chapters, and he has published several pieces in press and media. He had one of the most important roles in our communication field. He was the editor-in-chief of the Journal Communication and the International Journal Press Politics, journals that are concentrated in different pieces of communication research and crossing some fields' boundaries. He is also a member of the Latin American Program Advisory Board and editorial member from more than 10 journals. Among his outstanding awards, his book, Media Movements, Civil Society and Media Reform in Latin America, was awarded with the AMGMC Canson Latin America Book Award. He is currently a fellow of the International Communication Association, one of the most important communication research groups in the world. So please join me in welcoming Professor Silvio Weisbord.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Pablo, Diego, and Mora for the kind invitation to share my ideas with you, and of course to all the participants for finding the time um, to have a conversation. So what I want to talk today, let me share the screen. Um, so this is the title, slightly modified title of my original title, Revisiting the Craft of Communication Scholarship Amid the Slog of Dewesternization. So what I wanted to share with you is sort of what I wish that I would have known when I got started in academia about 35 years ago, which is how to position ourselves in communication studies, especially as Latinx scholars, as in my case, or for that matter, for scholars based in the South or doing communication work in the South, or scholars from the global South who are immigrants in the global North. And I think that this is sort of suitable for what I think is the spirit of this Latinx digital media seminar. The way I see it is, and again, kudos to Pablo and Mora and everybody else for putting the series together. I think that the series deliberately encourages sort of a conversation about biography and academic profession, where these two issues intersect. Because I think that is about cross-border academy, political issues, cultural issues, personal. And I think that this is an important space because actually we have very few opportunities for stimulating self-awareness and conversations about our position in communication studies, as well as a critical understanding of how communication studies is constituted. And I think that is also relevant because in the pandemic, I think what the pandemic has done, among other things, as we know, has renewed interest in questions about our position as scholars, given the obvious difficulties for separating life from work, the collapse of boundaries, inequalities in academic production and visibility, and also the fact that the social media have provided, for better in this case, a platform for voicing and debating these issues. So it is in this spirit that I want to share some thoughts, which is a reflexibility about the conditions of our work, which in my mind is linked to a growing sort of interest across academia, a growing interest in slow scholarship as well as in the ethics of care, in the sense that these positions interrogate approaches to academic work and the overall context. And I think we don't discuss and act upon these issues sufficiently. So before I get started with the specific of my presentation, I wanted to ask how are you doing? And I hope that your dreams came true, the dreams that you had for the last year. I'm being facetious here, of course. My fortune cookie back in March was I will travel far and wide, both pleasure and business. Of course, that has not happened. So aside from that, this is a summary of what I wanted to talk about. What is the craft of communication scholarship and what should it be? What are the structural conditions of scholarship in communication studies? How do we think about the built-in biases in the global academy? The position of scholarship about and in the global South? The academic paths given the limits of de-Westernization, or what I call here the long slog of de-Westernization, and the way that we navigate problems and opportunities. So what is the craft of communication scholarship? The idea of craft stuck with me when I read the book, The Craft of Sociology, a book by Pierre Bourdieu and co-authors back in the 80s. And it stuck with me because it was sort of raised questions about what is it that we need? What are the skills, the tools, the competencies that we need in order to be a sociologist when I was studying sociology? But the question is relevant across disciplines, which is what do we need to learn? What do we teach in order to be, let's say, in order to have what we might call a rewarding, productive, and happy academic life Of course, if happiness, if you are into happiness. But the question is, how do we understand this vast toolkit, which includes theories and methodologies and skills for research design? And my take here is the following, that the conventional approach is insufficient because it rarely addresses structural conditions underpinning academic work. This is about individuals that not necessarily foregrounds conventionally the position that we occupy just because of where we are located in global academia and what our interests, our passions are. So what I want to talk is sort of, we need to talk more in concrete terms and more in the context in which scholarship actually happens in communication studies. Let me quickly sort of map out what I think are some of the key structural conditions of scholarship in communication studies. Of course, the underlying premise here is that structure does matter, as structuralists and engineers always remind us, that we should not think only in terms of individual actions or individual agency, but when we are thinking about scholarship, we should be aware of structural conditions. And here there are sort of 5 groupings of condition. One is fragmentation, which many scholars already have documented how the communication studies as a global field continues to be fragmented in multiple directions, areas of specialization, and so on. The internationalization of communication studies in the way that professional associations, journals have tried to engage, to involve an international community of scholars. Globalization, which globalization I find it different than internalization. Globalization is how do we establish connections and how do we form a global community of scholars in communications studies. The 4th issue is global inequalities, which recent studies have documented the way that sort of that global academia still speaks with a very strong Western accent, or I will say the accent of some academic cultures and some countries that have a disproportionate presence in global academia. This has to do with the professional infrastructure of organizations, journals. It has to do, of course, with the language, the fact that we're speaking in English here. It is an example of English as a lingua franca without being too meta about this. Resources, academic traditions that ground the work are still primarily grounded in a few countries in the West, as well as access to resources from funding to library access. But at the same time, what we have seen in the last decades is a push for de-Westernization, for decolonization, which in my mind sort of amount to a push for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the global communication, in the global community of communication scholars. The situation right now, I would say, looks like this, that there is clearly, again, communication studies is not the exception, but actually is the norm of what we have seen across the social sciences and the humanities, as well as the sciences, of a situation of a center and periphery. And this has built-in biases. Built-in biases, I think we can think about them in 4 ways. Some biases have to do with the research agenda, which is what do we study? What are the issues that get priority in journals, in conferences, in the way that we talk about it? We know that in academia, we're prone to fads and fashions in the way that we think about research questions or important research questions. The question here is whose questions are we focusing on? Whose questions are we discussing? And typically, of course, will be the case that what absorbs, what attracts much of the attention tend to be questions that come out of the reality and debates of a few countries in the global north. Second is professional networks. And professional networks is the fact that primarily global communication studies is organized around professional networks constituted in the global north. There is research that Demeter has done in recent years And one of the conclusions that he has in his recent book is that it's very difficult to be a recognized communication researcher without global North capital, without sort of tapping being part of the professional networks that originally have been constituted in the global North. Third is about funding flows and volume, and of course, the fact that we have resource rich and resource poor academia around the world. Again, this is not unique to communication studies, but this is important because where the funding goes is about the priorities for research, and because the topics that funding goes after in some ways are embedded in particular local realities of specific countries or regions. And the last component of these built-in biases are the intellectual flows, which of course is not it's not a new idea, but it's about not only how ideas travel, but also how recognition, prestige, opportunities actually happens. What gets cited? What kind of work gets cited? Who gets recognized? So this builds up to sort of this Western-centric biases that we have in global academia, in the sense that the whole research enterprise is largely built on a rather limited number of cases and experiences, as well as theories, findings, and arguments, primarily grounded in the global North, at the expense of all kinds of knowledge produced everywhere else around the world, which renders knowledge from the global South, as well as some countries in the global North, almost invisible. Some people have made the argument that actually what this sort of disproportionate presence contributes to actually making completely invisible certain kinds of knowledges. Here I came up with an example, and this is not a communication journal, which is from the Journal of Peasant Studies that I used to read back in my graduate student days, which sort of taps into where the institutional affiliation of the authors. And this sort of produced a very familiar map, which is the heavy concentration of publication and likely topics, as well as theories and findings, methodologies, in a few places in the global North, with a few exceptions in East Asia and a few other countries around the world. And I deliberately put data from a non-communication journal just to sort of remind ourselves that we're dealing with a problem across academia, not unique to communication studies. So how does it affect Southern scholarship? How does it affect the position of scholarship about or in the global South? Well, in many ways. Before I go on, I'm aware of the limitations of the notion of the global South. In some ways, it is a little bit of a grab bag, but I think that it's a useful figure to talk about these questions. So what is the position? The position is the following, and probably many of you are familiar with this, have already experienced this. One is that these inequalities reinforce binary categories, in which we think about people in the field, scholars in the field, as quote unquote universal or thematic experts versus geographical experts. There are people who work on quote unquote big ideas, and then people who work on more niche, geographically grounded research. So how many times, for example, have you heard this when somebody introduces a colleague and says, I like to meet so-and-so, he is a scholar of Mexican journalism, or she's a scholar of Nigerian community media, instead of somebody being introduced as an expert on framing or media effects or media psychology, right? It's a different way of positioning and framing the way we think about the work that we do. In some ways, these binary categories are sort of carryover of the traditional division of area studies in many countries in the North. That is a sort of a Cold War leftover that we still cannot shake off. And this is how marginalization happens, by relegating certain kinds of work to a geographical expertise or to certain area studies. And of course, underpinning this is the question of Orientalism, as seeing that research as the other, not intrinsic, not embedded in a global academy. And here we have the problems of labels. I've always been skeptical, particularly of these labels that have to do with geopolitics, rather than thinking about knowledge boundaries in a different way. I'm skeptical of labels and boundaries, but in some ways, these kind of divisions reinforce negative ways of thinking about the work that we do. And of course, by doing this is the fact that this is seen as the other. So let me ask you another question. When was the last time you heard that arguments that are mainstream, common in the global north, have been revisited, interrogated by bringing up work about or from the south? Very rarely, in my experience, being in this field for several decades. So the question is the following: how do we decenter? How do we continue this movement to away from Western-centric scholarship? And in some ways, what has happened is the following. The idea is that the question of decentering is something that Global South scholars should do. And that is incorrect, to say the least, because this is a collective problem and therefore it demands collective solutions. Why? Because oftentimes I've seen the same people, typically scholars from the Global South or who work in the Global South, engage in this conversation rather than being a broader conversation. What is the problem here? The problem here is that fish don't question water, don't interrogate the overall conditions in which they live in. So decentering as a way of exploring, experimenting, being reflexive, being open, interrogating the premises of the work is something that should compete all of us. And this is part of the problem that it is somebody else's, the idea that it's somebody else's problem. Why? One of the problems is the risk that if this is not only our problem, but somebody else's problem, let's say scholars from the Global South or scholars working in the Global South, is that Global South scholarship becomes essentialized rather than being part of broader global theoretical conceptual discussions about any given subject. The risk of tokenism, right? Showing a way that we are making progress in terms of de-Westernization or decolonization by having some examples of work that actually reflect a possible openness. And another risk is appropriation, which is taking ideas from someone else without recognizing what the origin, what the genealogy is of certain ideas. So here, another challenge here is this mentality that is not my problem. And it's everybody's problem, right? Because as long as this becomes seen as a problem only for Global South scholars or scholars interested in the Global South, it's unlikely we're gonna make significant progress. The centering is a question about how we make academic knowledge in communication studies, let's say more cosmopolitan, that is not grounded by geographical boundaries, but is engaged in common questions. And this is what presents the current challenges. So because of these conditions that I just described, these are questions that I will think most of us who come from the South or think about questions grounded in the Global South inevitably confront, which is what are our academic paths given the limits of de-Westernization, the slow movement of this Westernization? In order to understand the academic paths, the first issue to understand is that we occupy a liminal position. We occupy this in-between position. And this is not just done by location. It's not because of where we live or where is our institutional affiliation. It's just because of the intellectual condition. It's because of the subjects that we study that puts us in that position. For us, I will say de-Westernization or decolonization is not an option. It's a default position. It's a necessary sensibility just because of the position that we occupy in the global academia. In some ways, it is another example of the curse of knowledge. It's a cognitive bias that we have just because of what we are interested in, not because of our citizenship or origins or any of those sort of issues. And therefore, in my mind, we are more likely to take a skeptical position vis-a-vis academic traditions, the theoretical canon, epistemological debates, the style of scholarship. This position of in-betweenness impregnates absolutely everything that we do because we are situated in this in-between position. This position of multi-perspective or comparison or sensitivity to difference or bricolage is almost second nature to us just because of what we do. Therefore, some of the ideas that more recently in academia in the North have gained some traction, like the question about how identity affects your scholarship, it's an old question for us because it has been embedded in the way we think and we approach our work from the get-go. So let me conclude now with sort of how do we navigate problems? And of course, if we want to be engaged in the global academia, I will say these are the questions that we frequently confront. Of course, for those who want to disentangle, don't want to have any links to global academia, it's a different set of questions. But for us who love and want to be engaged in global academia, given these asymmetries, inequalities that I described, then we have options. Let me just highlight three. One is between niche and mainstream lines of inquiry. Do we choose something that eventually might pigeonhole us as a scholar of a certain geography, or we try to position our work along different lines? And to me, the answer to this has been sort of taking a problem-centered approach rather than a locality or geographical approach because it's loaded with this sort of connotations that I mentioned earlier. Also, we are located between academic communities. So what we need to do is actually build our own community of belonging. Here is the value of what we call as the mind hive, that is not probably a single community, again, given the position that we occupy. And the value that our knowledge is suspended is sort of embedded in multiple networks. And the third sort of question, opportunity, is how do we think about writing? Because most of us write in our second language or third language, that being English, given that English is the lingua franca. And then the option becomes whether we think about writing in English purely in instrumental purposes, just to get publications out, just to express ourselves, or we try to develop our unique voice, which is extremely difficult and it takes time, takes a lot of work in a language that is not necessarily ours. And that takes years. There is a great Miles Davis quote that says, "It takes years to play like yourself." And I think that also applies to academia in the sense that it takes years, especially if you're working on your second or third language, being English, to actually sound like yourself. And I'm raising these questions because I don't think they have a straight answer, but I think that are questions that many of us continuously debate. In conclusion, what to do? I think that primarily we need to give visibility to these questions, and not just among us, but among everybody else. We need to foster a shift in dominant structures and practice, and that's everybody's work. It's not just the task or the priority of people, scholars grounded in Global South scholarship. We need to find spaces for discussions and suggestions. And we need to remind everybody why these inequalities actually impoverish the field, rather than that is something that only affects some scholars. And finally, I want to sort of say that this is a collective problem and that we need to promote collective solutions, as I mentioned earlier. And I think that we need to take advantage and create spaces to actually raise awareness about the structural issues, as well as to open the debate about concrete solutions to these challenges. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Weisbord. Thanks for your incredible talk. I am moved even because I'm from Chile. I worked several years there as a part of the School of Communication. And right now I'm just doing my studies here in the US. And I always struggling about how I can do better in order to raise and bring visibility to the issues that we, the Chilean scholars, we're trying to study. So in the meantime, I will, to all our participants, we have a Q&A feature. You can ask your questions and we will be very happy to read them. In the meantime, I have some questions related particularly about the structural transformations that we require. For example, I was thinking about this idea of the center and the periphery. And still I feel, I don't know about others, but in terms about the most political agenda and the media agenda still is concentrated in the global north. And we can say that that's something that even like the media in the global south considers a lot. Like, for example, the US election, it was not something important here in the US, also it was important in many of our countries. So how we can, at least given this contextual structure, like at the end, the global north predominates the agenda, how we can do a better effort in order to promote the topics and events that happens in the south?
Great question. In some ways, I ask myself that question all the time, which is how do we raise awareness, not only about the structural issues, but actually about relevant topics. And let me tell you what I think is the main challenge here. The main challenge is in curiosity. The lack of curiosity is, I think, is one of the problems. It's not just that in order to address the structural inequalities in whatever ways we can be imaginative about it, which I think we have made some important steps, but insufficient steps in the global academia to address this. The main problem is not just the lack of awareness, it's the lack of curiosity. It's interest of this. So because of lack of curiosity, every time you're trying to bring awareness about the relevance of a given subject that doesn't enter the radar of global north scholarship, then you say, well, who cares about it? Why does it matter? Or even worse, that you have to make it relevant by, quote unquote, speaking the language of debates in the global north in order to get understanding that issue is important. So let me give you one example. Violence against the press has gained important attention in the global north, at least in some countries, including the United States, in the recent years. This has been a chronic problem around the global south for decades, How much research has been done or actually pay attention or put the spotlight on that? Very, very limited in the global north. Only when there's an opening, because the global north is, or some people believe that there is a problem, and in fact, it is a growing problem. The question of violence against the press, particularly online, then we see sort of some evidence or that the problem is getting some attention, that is making people a little bit more curious about it. So my short answer to your question is, the question that you're asking is, how do we make people more curious about issues that not necessarily are within their radar, shaped by the local media or by the local sort of academy in which they work?
Thanks for the answer. And we have one from the participants. I think it's related to what we were talking about. I will read it now from Daniel Twilly. And he says, thank you for your eye-opening and thought-provoking talk. I have a question about the part about the weight of national local issues in research agendas. All of the communication that we study, regardless of the location where it takes place, is mediated by platforms and companies based in the United States. How, or it is even possible to extricate our research from the United States related tensions that emerge from that? Or is the solution to encompass it and contextualize it?
Great question. Thank you very much. So I think there are at least two dimensions of Danielle's question. One is about the power of agenda setting, right? The agenda setting of sort of setting the research agenda. How do we, I mean, the way that Danielle phrases is, let me just open this. Is it to extricate our research from the US? Of course it is possible. It should be possible and it should be necessary. The question is, given the huge presence of US related questions, empirical questions or theoretical questions or conceptual frameworks, is how do we position ourselves? And of course, there's plenty of room around that, but it depends on where your goals are, where you are located. So I think that sort of the particularities of your position in terms of your biography, as well as your intellectual sort of identity, the way that you define your own intellectual work, will shape the way that you answer the question, whether or not we can extricate our research from US issues. And the other issue I think that embedded in Danielle's question is because these platforms are primarily US platforms and they function according to US principles in terms of ethical issues, business, legal issues. Inevitably, it forces us to engage. It's very difficult if you're doing work, let's say, on digital policy without knowing a good deal of amount about US digital policy, because otherwise it's very difficult to understand Facebook or WhatsApp or Google around the world without understanding US digital policy. So that is a way in which we're pulling to sort of understanding and knowing. That is part of the in-betweenness, right? Not only that we might be experts on digital media policy in our own countries about specific issues, but because we are studying this global dominant hegemonic presence of Silicon Valley companies, in some ways we have no option but to be somewhat familiar or experts in some cases on digital media policies in the US. That is another example of sort of that whether we want it or not, we are located in this in-between position. Thank you.
We have another question here from Joe Cali. Thank you for these reflections. I'm wondering how could we drive towards collective solutions within structures that are anti-ethical to collectivism, given the overwhelming drive towards individualism in North American academia. It's international associations. In other words, are there spaces for solidarities?
Thank you, Joe. Great question again. I think that if it's sort of the thing that is not necessarily by design, but is it by pushing, by actually finding and creating those spaces. Those spaces do not exist, or I mean, have not existed sort of by definition. The question is, how do we use different so-called international association with international and global ambitions as part of the infrastructure for this? I strongly believe that much can be done in terms of raising awareness and carving out spaces for these conversations as well as for actions. And I understand that some people, some colleagues over the years have become sort of frustrated, disappointed, and decide not to be members or to be part of certain associations because of these built-in biases. And of course, I respect those decisions. But the question is that in some cases, we cannot, afford not to engage with international organizations in different parts of the world, whether it's in Europe, in the Americas, in Asia, or in Africa, in these conversations. And that is what I think, Joe, sort of by calling solidarity, it is a question of how you bring people together around a common goal, a common solution. Again, this idea that it's not our problem, it's everybody's problem, right?
I'm curious in that line if, for example, something that we have seen not only in communications, but in other fields, all this, for example, all the issues from Latinx communities in the United States, and also, for example, immigration. Right now, it's just something more visible because of the press and so on. So it's bringing into this core about questions, things related to our identities or to our stories, right? About our heritage. So is that a one way in order to create the link between the global North, the global South, if it's possible to consider that space as one way to that these two worlds communicate to each other?
Great question, Diego. Let me do some sort of thinking in the moment right now. I think there is a bias here, probably, that the way that these matters of identity, not just professional identity, but social identities work in this country, which is about you struggle and you fight for the recognition of a certain identity, certain demands, certain causes, certain genealogies. And that in some ways, I think that is the model has been translated into American professional associations, which is you bring people who believe are part of a certain community of interest, a community of practice, and you fight for recognition. You try to carve out the space rather than being something that necessarily or primarily is sort of cross-cutting, right? I mean, in some ways, that seems to me is the question, because it will make sense that in some ways, the way that academia functions mirrors the way that some of these dynamics work in American society at large. If you follow the history of, let's say, identity politics, or if you follow the history of immigration, or if you follow the history of different identity-based movements in this country, in some ways it will make sense that the way that it works in academia is a reflection or a continuation of a similar process. And I'm not saying this is right or this is wrong. It is way in which that, again, it grounds these questions in academia based in the particular history and trajectories of the society. These academic questions are not just sort of detached from the way that universities, academic in general, is organized in certain countries. And my hunch will be that probably these questions in academia might work differently in other countries because of a different sort of history, trajectory of the way that questions about identity, for example, are organized in society and in politics.
Right. And also given that institutions in different countries, they have other needs, especially given like there are many public universities in the South, so they need to focus on issues and topics related to the country.
Right, absolutely, absolutely.
Right, thank you for your answer. We have a third question from the public. It's from Daniel, and he asks, this is one that is more practical, and he says about resource and rich versus resource poor research. We here are in resource rich institutions, and I guess from the global North. Yeah. How can we, particularly PhD students and junior scholars who might not be as empowered as senior scholars, share the wealth of our resources?
Great question. I think probably how do we find wealth? And we have wealth in ways that probably are invisible to us. Wealth will be not just funding, but it will be a question of the skills, the opportunities that we have, opportunities for publication, for collaboration, for presentation. This is all wealth. This is all sort of the professional networks that we are beginning to be plugged in when we are grad students in the global North, or in certain universities in the global North, is part of, let's say, the capital that we're building, not just for ourselves, but the capital that we can sort of in a network way sort of share with others. And that is just the beginning. And I think something that I try to remind, especially senior scholars, about all these resources measured by opportunities, by connections, by where in what boards we sit, by invitations that we get for publication. This is all wealth. This is all networks. It's not just about funding, as important, as critical as that may be, because actually a way of getting to the funding question is by expanding, strengthening the professional networks, that kind of professional capital.
Thank you, Professor. We have a question from Facundo.
Thank you, Diego, and thank you, Silvio, for this wonderful presentation. I have a question. A couple of weeks ago, Clemencia Rodriguez presented her research about decolonizing research as well. And she accentuated the idea of non-extractive knowledge, and through the concept of territorio, how in environmental communication, we can think about the idea of, she mentioned this, like cooking the research together with the communities that we are trying to understand or help to develop in some way. So I wanted to know your thoughts on this, probably this tension between trying to decolonize our research and trying to investigate and research more in our communities, but at the same time trying to not extract knowledge from communities to that maybe be servicial to like North institution or institution from the North. Thank you.
Great question. So the question of extractive or non-extractive knowledge is a question that crosses sort of the global South, global North border, because about what do we do with the knowledge that we produce, from where we get the knowledge, what our responsibilities or the ethics of the purpose of our work. The extractive knowledge is basically about we extract knowledge from people in order to primarily advance our career or satisfy our intellectual curiosity, pursue our goals as individual scholars or as a team of scholars. The non-extractive is rethinking what is the purpose of our work, that in some ways could be of interest or benefit for the people with whom we build knowledge together. And that goes beyond the global South, the global North. I understand that has historically a strong colonialist component of extracting knowledge from people in the global South for the interest or for the benefit of academics or politics or whatever else, economics, in the global North. But I think that aside from that, it's a question that we can ask all the time, right? We can do research in the global South just for our own immediate benefit or for the benefit of people that we are studying with or studying about. It depends on the kind of work that you do. It depends on how you engage with the community. And in my experience, I mean, people have very different ways of approaching this, depending on who you're studying, what you're studying, and what you think your responsibilities are. Then again, this is one of those sort of ethics of care question that I think that is necessary. And I understand that originally comes more from researchers doing ethnographic work, but it's actually a question that no matter what methodology or research design you use, it's a cross-cutting question. You can do a survey and figure out ways in which you provide feedback or to provide knowledge that you gain from listening, from interviewing people, from running a survey. It's not about methodology, it's about sort of the ethics of research more than only a global South, global North divide.
Thank you, Silvio.
We have another question from the public, and it's from Professor Diakopoulos. He says, I'm wondering about the role of regional or national scholarship within the arc of globalization. When I think about news media, for instance, there is a distinct national media and only very little of what is translated from the global audiences. How should a global academia think about the pros and cons of creating spaces for scholarship that are more focused on national or regional issues? Should we be thinking about federalism or rather devolution of the scholarship?
Great question. If I understand correctly what the federalism is, it's sort of the recognition of certain degree of autonomy in existence and finding connecting threads among that is, I mean, among different sort of ways of thinking about knowledge. I will be fine with that, and I think we try to do that in many ways when we have editions of journals in different languages, for example, or when we have abstracts in different languages. A model of inclusion, one would say, in trying to engage and make work available to more people, not assuming necessarily that is sort of fluent in academic English. But I will be cautious about creating more spaces for national and regional issues, because that might sort of quickly become essentialist. It's the question that we agree that how do we give visibility? How do we raise the visibility of certain forms of knowledge in the global South that are not properly recognized without essentializing that, without saying is unique to the global South in ways that it further separates from conversations across geography, which will be my preferred option. My preferred option here is that if we take any sort of national regional labels, to be extremely careful, because there is a strong tradition of sort of othering that knowledge rather than sort of being more, not just inclusive in terms of recognizing diversity, but in terms of engaging with diversity to question, to interrogate, to enrich knowledge writ large. In principle, I'm in favor of not using any of these geographical labels because they are loaded with, I will say, even though they might be well-intentioned, they are loaded with potential problems of sort of, in some way, making certain knowledge niche rather than sort of denichifying content, especially when it comes attached to certain geographical labels. That to me will be a much better way of thinking about global knowledge. That's why I vindicate the notion of cosmopolitanism, which means it's a much more helpful notion rather than the notion that simply is about recognizing or making space for quote unquote national regional knowledge. Right?
Right. Thank you, Professor. We have a question from Maura.
Thank you, Professor Waisbord, for this really insightful presentation. I have a question that comes because I was really impacted by the quote you gave us about Miles Davis saying that it was really, that it takes years to find your own voice in a way or play like yourself. And I'm thinking about the issue of English as the lingua franca of scholarship in general, but communication studies also. And this might be a little bit pragmatic, but I'm wondering how we can actually decenter English as a lingua franca in communication studies. Is it about literally translations? I'm thinking this in two ways, at least. As someone who has worked in Argentina and is now a student in the US, I'm thinking that much literature that comes mostly from the global north and the US doesn't appear in Argentinian scholarship because of the issue of translation. So there are many courses that don't include different parts of communication scholarship. For instance, formal communication studies. There's literally almost nothing that's written in Spanish about that. So that creates that creates the situation that in Argentina people many times don't tend to study those topics. Right. And then the other way around. The idea that many things that are written in Spanish or in different languages, but I'm thinking Spanish because I'm Latin American, don't arrive to the United States or to the global North academia. And also just the idea that, and this is personal, perhaps the idea of just this great disadvantage that we have as non-native English speakers, right? And the idea that it's very difficult for us to find our own voice in a language that's not ours. So if we are living in a world in which there's machine learning and translation services, and I mean, is it just a pragmatical question? Is it political? I guess it's political in the end, right? But I'm just wondering whether you have any pragmatical advice on this. Thank you so much.
So the pragmatic solution is, in the meantime, where we solve the political question, I think, which is how do we adjust or accommodate or find our space, our voices, given this situation. It's unlikely that, English as lingua franca will go away anytime soon. So in the meantime, we have to figure out what we need to do. In addition to translation in multiple languages, from the South to English and from English to several languages in the global South, the situation is better than what it was because of machine learning, et cetera. But it could be time consuming, or in some cases, resource consuming to actually produce that. That is partially why the vast majority of journals based in the global North, which are the dominant journals in the global academia, don't do it because of the cost associated with it, especially when it is corporate run. This matters to it factors into the bottom line. So what to do in the meantime, I think, is we try to do the best we can by trying to develop our skills and our way of thinking in English. And I always have said that English is not just about the language issue. It's not just a translation issue. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of the way that we think about our work and about a field. It's not just a linguistic matter. That should be relatively, let's say, easy, even though it's not easy to address. But it's the embeddedness of the way that we think in academic English as shaped by English-speaking academy around the world. The way that we write, the way that we think, the way that we represent in public. So it's not just a matter of being able to read or speak or write in English. It's even more complicated than that. And everybody who has gone through that experience knows that it's a constant, ongoing experience of learning about it. And we have to figure that out along the way by capitalizing on whatever resources, formal resources that exist, as well as informal resources. And that goes back to the question about wealth that was asked earlier. If we feel somewhat confident writing in English, presenting in English, why don't we share that wealth with people who probably don't feel that way? That is a way of strengthening the visibility of certain ideas or the presence of certain scholars. So it requires work, it requires thinking. We have to make a deliberate effort just for our own improvement. And we have to put time. And, I've been here for 33 plus years, and it's something that I try to cultivate because there was so much room for learning, especially if you want to develop your own voice, meaning you don't just want to write a paper. You want to basically show readers or write the way that you think, not the way that you write. And writing the way that you think takes much more effort, especially if you're thinking in your second or third language, right? And that is the disadvantage. But in some ways, in some cases, it's a choice that we make. In some cases, for other scholars, it's not a choice that they made. But they're confronted with the fact that they have to be completely conversant and comfortable with writing and speaking in English. That's because it's one of those structural issues that we discussed earlier. And there is no simple formula. We just figure it out. I mean, that's what I found out along the way. There is we come up with our own textbook or handbook or how to navigate these questions. And very rarely, either most of our professors are aware of that, are familiar with that, or will actively say, this is an issue, let me see if we can work together. So I will stop there. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Silvio, for a great talk. We have one more question in the Q&A, but I'm aware that you have to leave for another important meeting, so we will not keep you much longer. I want to thank Silvio for a spectacular presentation, very thought-provoking and very important. I want to thank Diego for great moderation as always. The audience for staying with us through the end. This is the last seminar of the winter quarter here at Northwestern, seminar number 20. We will resume in 3 weeks with the spring quarter seminar series. The first one will be by Ulises Mejias from State University of New York at Oswego. on the 8th of April at noon Central Time. I hope to see you all there, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your weeks. Thanks again, Silvio. This was absolutely spectacular.
Thank you very much.